One of the core goals of sustainable development is to help make our societies more equal so that everybody has the dignity and the conditions for a decent life. Indeed, in 1948, 3 years after the United Nations was established, the world's governments, that is, the member states of the United Nations, adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a landmark document. It says that all people are born free and in equal dignity and have, as a matter of their human dignity, the right to basic economic conditions, the right to have decent livelihoods, access to education, access to health, access to safe shelter, access to food, access to other basic needs and social protections. And one of the ideas is that in a world in which each person has their rights and their ability to pursue a decent life, we will have a society that is more equal, less unstable, and with more trust and confidence within the society, less divided by income classes and by huge inequalities. In fact, if we go back to Aristotle's thinking in the Politics, the first book of political science in Western thought, Aristotle said that to have political stability requires a large middle class. That is a large part of the population that has decent living standards with relatively diminished gaps between the rich and the poor. So one of the core objectives of sustainable development is to reduce rampant inequalities, and SDG number 10 calls on all societies to take actions to reduce inequalities between societies, that is, in different parts of the world, between the rich and the poor, and within societies, that is, the gaps of income between the rich and the poor within a society. Let's explore the inequalities within our societies, and to do so, we invoke a standard statistical measure of inequality called the Gini coefficient. And you will study the Gini coefficient in your class and also understand the inequalities according to the Gini coefficient in your own society. But suffice it here to say as an introduction that the Gini coefficient is a number. It's calculated by looking at the distribution of income across individuals or across households in the society. And it's a number that ranges from 0 to 1. 0 in the Gini coefficient measurement would mean that everybody has exactly the same income. So if you went household to household, everybody would be basically the same. A Gini coefficient of 1 at the other extreme would be that one rich person has everything and all the rest have nothing. So the Gini coefficient is a summary measure that measures the concentration of income in a given group, typically in a nation or in a region. And here we have a map of the Gini coefficient for different countries of the world for which data are available, comparing households within a single country. And in this map, the darker shades are the highest inequality, and countries with lighter shades are countries with less inequality. Or to put it in terms of the Gini coefficient, the higher the Gini coefficient, the darker the shade in this map, and the lower the Gini coefficient, the closer to 0, the lighter the shade. And again, we can see some notable patterns. Here are a couple that are quite important. We see the highest inequalities in the world in the southern tip of Africa, in South Africa. And we see high levels of inequality throughout the Americas, including Brazil, Mexico, the United States, and several other countries. We see the lowest levels of inequality in Western Europe, and within Western Europe, the very lowest levels of inequality in Northern Europe, especially in Scandinavia, meaning the countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Other parts of the world have variations on the theme. In general, the countries of sub-Saharan Africa are relatively unequal. In general, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe tend to be more equal, and so forth. Well, what accounts for these differences? The answer, once again, to a large extent, is history. Because inequality is a reflection of history and how politics and differences among groups in a society have shaped the economic life and, in this case, the inequalities across society. Consider the Americas, for example. What is distinctive about the Americas? What's distinctive about the Americas is that the Americas were shaped decisively in the 5th and 6th ages of globalization. Now, the Americas had their own history separate from the histories of the old world of Europe and Asia and Africa up until Columbus's voyage of 1492. The peoples of the Americas, the indigenous populations, had arrived in the Americas during the last ice age, when they could walk overland over Beringia from Asia to the Americas in a long migration, perhaps between 10,000 to 25,000 years ago, and a timeline that is still debated until today. But after settling North and South America, and after the end of the last ice age, when the sea level rose as the great glaciers of the Northern Hemisphere melted, that land bridge between Asia and the Americas was ended. It was submerged in a rising sea level, and there was no effective contact, or only very small contact, between the Americas and the old world of Europe, Asia, and Africa until Christopher Columbus's voyages beginning in 1492. But when those voyages came, everything was turned on its head, as we will see. The Europeans brought conquest, they brought subjugation of the indigenous peoples, they brought diseases of the old world which afflicted the indigenous peoples who had never seen such diseases before. And there was a massive dying off of the indigenous populations in the 16th century. The Americas were conquered by the Europeans and peopled by the Europeans, by the surviving indigenous populations who were subjugated to European power, and by a major new group, and that is Africans brought as slaves by the Europeans to serve in the mines and in the plantations of the Americas. And so the Americas became a region of huge inequalities in which the Europeans were the richest and the most powerful and dominated society politically, economically, and socially. and two major groups were subservient: the surviving indigenous peoples and the slave populations brought overwhelmingly from Africa. And what emerged in the Americas already in the 1500s, and it has persisted until today, are highly unequal societies divided by ethnicity and race. And this is why we see Gini coefficients in North America and in South America that are very, very high compared to counterpart populations. Now, in South Africa, we have one of the most extreme examples of this, because South Africa was colonized by the Dutch and then by the British. But in both cases, a small white population dominated the native African populations. And until today, the gaps between the European descent populations and the African populations are enormous, giving rise to some of the highest inequalities in the world. When we look at Europe, and especially at Northern Europe, though, we're also reminded of something that will be absolutely crucial for our study, which is that inequalities can be changed. They can be changed by public policy. Inequalities can be reduced by the direct action of the society to ensure that all parts of society are able to prosper. And what history has shown is that the single most important pathway to reduced inequality and prosperity for all is education for all. If the government ensures that there is accessible, free public education with quality for all members of the society, that by itself is a great, powerful instrument to reduce the inequalities in society. Northern Europe developed at the end of the 19th century, and in the 20th century, that is during the sixth age of globalization, during the industrial age, a set of public policies that came to be called social democracy that aimed specifically to reduce the inequalities. In the social democratic system, everybody pays a pretty high tax burden, but then those tax revenues are used to ensure universal access to quality education, universal access to quality health care, universal access to quality infrastructure, water, sanitation, power, now digital services. In many places, access to social housing for those who could not otherwise afford decent housing. And the results have been proved that through such policies, through such an approach of social democracy, it's possible to combine two desirable objectives: very high living standards and reduced inequalities within society. So the Scandinavian countries are the champions of SDG 10, of reducing inequalities within societies. We're going to return to this theme of inequality of wealth and power and politics repeatedly through our exploration of the 7 ages of globalization. But let's keep in mind that huge inequalities of income, while they may reflect a long history, are also solvable if we join together, make the commitment that no one should be left behind. It's possible to reduce these inequalities, reduce the Gini coefficient towards 0, and ensure decent lives for all parts of society.